Well, we're going to get started here for our lunchtime keynote address. And I'm very pleased to introduce Rosa Brooks, who is the Associate Dean of Graduate Programs and Professor of Law at Georgetown University. She teaches courses on international law, national security, constitutional law. She has been engaged in both in the scholarship and has worked at the Department of Defense. And amongst her many accomplishments, she is author of the recent book, How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything, which was published in 2016 by Simon & Schuster. We look forward to her comments, and I will pass the microphone to Rosa.
Thank you, Will. It's terrific to be here. I wasn't here in person during the morning, but I was racing back and forth between various other appointments, and I was live streaming the panels in my car, which was a terrific way to both eat up all of my data allowance on my iPhone, unfortunately, but also to get a sense of where the discussion was going, and obviously not in a particularly optimistic direction. I thought I would try to pull together some of the disparate strands from this morning's discussion by focusing particularly on the rule of law. I'm not going to talk about civil liberties and balancing. I'm not sure what that means. I've never been sure what that means. But I want to talk about the ways in which, particularly post 9/11, U.S. actions and U.S. legal arguments have begun to really undermine the rule of law more deeply. And let me say a little bit, start by what I mean by that, right? The rule of law is one of those terms that we toss around, but we don't always define. We use it as a kind of handy shorthand to refer to everything good, democracy, rights, liberty, you name it, apple pie. But there are lots of books have been written on what the rule of law is, but at its sort of thinnest, in its least substantive form, if nothing else, we think of the rule of law as something where we have a system of rules that apply equally to everybody and that are known and that render the behavior of everybody relatively predictable. That we think of the rule of law as providing a certain stability. We think of it as constraining, as sort of a fundamental purpose of the rule of law is to constrain and channel violence, coercion, and power, and to render it predictable, render its operations stable. And that's true both domestically and internationally. And I want to talk a little bit about one of the ways in which the U.S.'s responses to 9/11 has really, in all kinds of ways, some of which are, I think, obvious and others of which are harder to see, begun to undermine the rule of law in a variety of ways by reducing the degree to which we can have any degree of consensus on what is lawful and what is not lawful, the degree to which we can have any consensus at all, domestically or internationally, on when it's appropriate for states to use force, when it's appropriate to monitor citizens' communications, when it's appropriate to detain people, and under what circumstances. And I'll say, let me try to explain a little bit more what I mean. So after 9/11, one of the things that we saw was a tendency on the part of the U.S. government, which has sort of gotten more and less pronounced at different points in time, to view terrorism through the legal lens of war. Not just through the metaphoric lens of war, war on poverty, war on drugs, et cetera, but through the legal lens of war. And to view all U.S. activities that were connected with counterterrorism similarly through that legal lens. This matters because internationally and domestically, in many ways, we have quite different legal regimes that operate when we're in a war, or an armed conflict is the technical term, compared to the legal framework that is operative when we're not in an armed conflict. And I don't have very much time, so just to say it very, very simply, the legal framework that operates during times of armed conflict is much more permissive than ordinary law towards secrecy, towards coercion, towards surveillance, towards the use of lethal force, towards lack of democratic accountability, towards not having the kinds of typical checks and balances that we think of as being important to a democracy. And we tolerate a legal framework for wartime that is more permissive in terms of government secrecy, coercion, et cetera, because we tend to think of wartime as a temporary period. You know, that war we conceptualize as something that's a temporary deviation from the norm, which is peacetime. So it's okay to have this legal framework which tolerates less rights-friendly activities because we assume that wars end. They may take 2 years, they may take 5 years, they may even take 10 or 12, but they're going to have an end. And so we temporarily suspend ordinary rules, our ordinary assumptions about due process, checks and balances, et cetera, because we presume that wars are going to come to an end. Obviously, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, when it comes to terrorism, and particularly the kind of non-state transnational terrorism we've been seeing in the post-9/11 universe, it gets harder and harder, though, to say where a war is, when it begins and ends, who's part of it. We don't have, in a war on terrorism, there are no geographic boundaries. We can't say, here's where the battlefield is, here's where it's not. We can't say, as we said in World War II, okay, you know, France is part of the war, so is Germany, but Switzerland is neutral. The war seems to morph from place to place. We can't say who's a part of the war with any confidence because the actors keep morphing and changing, and they are not restricted to any one state or any one nationality or any one ideology, for that matter, any one set of goals. And we can't say when we don't even know what a weapon is, we don't know what a combatant is, and we certainly can't say with any certainty when the war will end. And again, we don't always know, we never know when a war will end with specificity, but we usually assume that there will be an end, whereas a war on terrorism, by definition, doesn't really have any clear end state. So what that does, as we define more and more things in our counterterrorism toolkit as being part of the world of war and armed conflict, and thus subject to those rules, which I don't, let me just say, since 9/11, we've done that more and more. We have defined more and more as part of war, and I don't think that's necessarily legally wrong. You know, the one thing that the law of armed conflict does not do is define armed conflict. And while it is not inevitable, the legal framework didn't dictate that we would end up saying, okay, we're going to call this war as opposed to something else, as opposed to anti-crime activities or something like that. Neither does it preclude that. I don't think it was legally incorrect for the Bush administration and the Obama administration after it to decide that it was an available legal framework. Nothing in the law itself precluded using it. And so the US government, 2 successive presidential administrations, chose to use that legal framework, because why wouldn't you? If you're the President of the United States, why would you not choose a legal framework that gives you much, much greater latitude with less accountability and less oversight if you have that available to you? You know, and of course, every president is convinced that they're acting responsibly and in good faith. And if you think you're acting responsibly in good faith, why wouldn't you choose to use the tools that have come with fewer strings attached? And that's what we've done. The trouble is, not everybody agrees with the U.S.'s decision to place various things in the legal box called war. Many of our European allies view these issues quite differently. Human rights groups often view the issues quite differently and say, no, United States government, you've kind of made a category mistake. This isn't war, this is crime, or it's better addressed through law enforcement tools, et cetera, et cetera. Here's what happens when you have a situation which, as I said, you've got this fundamental ambiguity as to whether the law of war framework is the right legal framework or not. The problem is, if you can't quite decide that, if you have no basis for making that decision, if it's just a political decision, not a legally driven decision, then you have no legal basis for deciding the most important issues that a democracy has to decide, such as which issues should be subject to judicial review versus what should be decisions for executive branches to make alone. Such as who can be detained for how long, under what circumstances, with what degree of due process. Such as when can a government surveil and monitor its citizens or others, and with what degrees of due process protections. Such as ultimately When can you use lethal force and when can you not? And obviously it matters enormously which legal framework we pick. To give just one of the most obvious examples and something I've written about a lot, take US drone strikes, counterterrorism drone strikes in places such as Yemen or Pakistan or Somalia. If the law of armed conflict applies, if we decide that the law of armed conflict applies, if we decide that al-Shabaab or various Yemeni militants or Pakistani militants count as combatants, legally speaking, in an armed conflict with the United States because they're members of al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda's associated forces, and if we believe that the conflict extends to wherever they happen to be it the Philippines or Pakistan or Libya or Syria or Iraq or wherever, and if we believe that combatants don't need to carry traditional weapons or anything like that, well then the US drone strikes, or whether they're actual drone strikes or whether they're raids carried out by special operations forces or strikes carried out by manned aircraft, doesn't really matter. But if we think that the law of war is applicable and that they're combatants in that conflict, then the drone strikes, et cetera, are the lawful wartime targeting of enemy combatants. And morally and legally, there is absolutely nothing that is different in those drone strikes than in a US soldier on the beaches at Normandy shooting at a German machine gun nest. They're exactly the same, legally speaking. On the other hand, if we think that the law of armed conflict framework is not the right framework to apply, then they're just extrajudicial murders. Then the United States is murdering people around the world without due process, and they're extrajudicial executions, and they're a blatant violation of international human rights law, not to speak of probably a violation of the sovereignty of the affected countries, which in many cases have given consent only rather ambiguously. So it really matters, right? We really want to know the difference. We really want to have some basis for saying, oh, the US is right to say that this is the law of armed conflict is the right framework, versus the US is wrong to say it. We want to know the difference. But at the moment, it's almost impossible to give any consistent or principled reason to say it should be one or it should be the other, because we have essentially, we're in a world in which we have binary legal categories. There's essentially an on-off switch for war. Either you're in an armed conflict or you're not. And there's nothing in between. You're either in one legal framework or you're not, and they're quite radically different, and they give us radically different results when we try to evaluate something, such as drone strikes. But we live in a non-binary world where increasingly the kinds of threats that the US and other states are facing look kind of like war, but they look kind of like crime, and they sort of don't look like war, and they sort of don't look like crime, that they are in the middle. They don't fit neatly. And as we increasingly address threats such as cyber conflict, potentially around the corner, threats that might arise from bioengineered viruses or something like that, I think we're going to more and more find ourselves in this murky world where the situations are in a gray zone that don't look exactly like war and don't look exactly like peace and criminal behavior in peacetime, and yet we are stuck with this kind of binary legal framework as a matter of international law, which is reflected in the domestic laws of most states. To make things worse, and pause, let me just say, think about what that does to efforts to even talk about the rule of law, right? Because fundamental to the rule of law, as I said, is if you want to constrain state power, you have to know when it's lawful and when it's not. That's our, how do you decide? If you lose any basis for deciding, if you lose any international or domestic consensus on what is lawful and what is not lawful, if you lose any international domestic consensus even on what law is the right law to apply, how to categorize things, then you lose that ability to meaningfully constrain state behavior. You, in fact, lose your ability to meaningfully predict state behavior. Because I certainly do not know how the US chooses which militant groups to define as associated forces of al-Qaeda, for instance. I'm not sure, I'm not totally convinced, in fact, that the US government is sure it knows how to define that. But if you don't know that, and if you don't know things like on what basis will the US decide, let's say a sovereign state says we don't consent to you using force against these suspected al-Qaeda or their associated forces, people in our country, The U.S. has said, well, we reserve the right to act unilaterally if you're unwilling or unable to take appropriate action. Well, I don't know what that means either, right? And I don't think any of us know what it means. When is a state unwilling or unable? What are the criteria for determining that? Much less, what are the criteria of determining, even if we think we know who an associated force of Al-Qaeda is, whether a particular individual is part of that associated force? And if we don't know those things, we don't know what the U.S. is going to do. We don't know when it's going to do it. We don't know when the U.S. is going to decide that it's okay to use force inside the borders of other sovereign states and when it's not. And, of course, we create a precedent that other states are free to follow, and we've already seen Russia invoking it quite expressly in Ukraine and other contexts, in which the international legal rules that govern the use of force start getting chipped away at because nobody quite knows what they are anymore. Let's see. This has consequences that cut across the board domestically and internationally. And let me just briefly mention a few of those. And I'm going to try to be super brief because I know some of these issues have been discussed already today, and we don't have too much time. But let me separate the consequences into I guess, three different categories. So what are the consequences when we lose our ability to have any consensus about what the right legal framework is, and when we lose our ability to sort of predict how states will act and to agree with each other about when it's acceptable and when it's not, and what the criteria should be for determining when it's acceptable. One set of consequences has to do with domestic U.S. issues and has to do with democratic accountability and what it means to live in a democracy. Another set of consequences has to do with the impact it has on other states' behaviors towards their own populations. And then I think a third set of consequences has to do with the impact on the international legal order itself and the set of rules governing use of force and sovereignty that have existed since the end of World War II. So let me just briefly outline what I mean in each of those categories. So the first impact of this ambiguity and sort of erosion of the rule of law on U.S. domestic political culture and law. As I said a moment ago, if you can't decide what law applies, then it becomes impossible to answer any of these really fundamental questions about who can be detained for how long, under what circumstances, under what legal theory, why, et cetera. It becomes impossible to decide whether surveillance of citizens is a permissible temporary exercise of government authority during an armed conflict or an impermissible violation of constitutional rights. It becomes impossible to decide whether drone strikes are lawful wartime targeting of enemy combatants or nothing more than murder. And that's bad, right? I think we want to know the difference and we want to feel confident that we know the difference. And we can't answer those questions anymore. But I think it goes a little bit deeper than that. One of the things that came up earlier, and I just wanted to highlight, is that partly because that law of war framework is much more tolerant of secrecy and lack of accountability, we have increasingly been in an era in which the United States government, vis-a-vis its own citizens, as well as vis-a-vis the rest of the world, has both secret laws and secret wars, which as a citizen I find rather shocking. I find it rather shocking that the United States government still declines to make public the legal theories behind many of the drone strikes. We've had a couple of leaked documents, but that's about it. Still does not want to make public some of the legal theories, as Jennifer Daskell was saying this morning, that it's operating on in terms of using national security letters and so forth, and you give more and more examples of this. That's pretty scary, frankly. That as Jen said this morning, it's one thing to have secret investigations or secret operations that are kept secret until they are carried out, and maybe even short time afterwards to protect the identities of people involved and so forth. But it's another thing to have secret laws, is quite chilling and really antithetical, I think, to the whole idea of the rule of law, because how can you determine whether state actors are complying with the law when you don't know what they think the law is and when they don't tell you what they think the law is. I also worry about secret wars. Obviously, we've had two very open conflicts in the post-9/11 era, Iraq and Afghanistan. And whatever you might say about the Iraq War, for instance, George W. Bush did not try to hide the fact that the US was going to war in Iraq. He didn't say Iraq War, what Iraq War, I can neither confirm nor deny that we're going to war in Iraq. He said, yeah, we're going to war in Iraq. I'm sending up 100,000 plus US troops. Here's what we're going to do. So you might hate it, but you knew it was happening. Whereas what I call the secret war, the sort of a third secret war that's been going on more or less in parallel to those two open conflicts, and I'm not even counting sort of brief, intermittent military actions such as Libya in 2011, is a largely drone and special operations war that has spanned multiple countries, at least 7 or 8, and that has killed at least 4,000 or 5,000 people, as targeted by U.S. airstrikes and raids and so forth. And yet, to this day, although everyone who reads the papers knows that that war in Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan and elsewhere is taking place, the U.S. government still, with the exception of a tiny fraction of strikes, those that have been targeting U.S. citizens, has not even acknowledged particular strikes, much less the basis, the costs, the impact, and so forth of those strikes. And I find that rather chilling as well, and obviously really threatening to any idea of the rule of law, to have a powerful government using lethal force on that scale, not as a marginal occasional thing, but on a consistent year in, year out scale, killing thousands of people over many years and formally not refusing to acknowledge it. Another issue that I don't have time to go into, but would love to urge people to think about and talk about is what I call trickle-down war, and something I talk about a little bit in the book that Will mentioned, the ways in which the erosion of clarity on what is lawful and what is not has kind of trickled down into domestic court proceedings, into policing, into rules on immigration and border control, into even municipal government practices on transparency and what is available to the public and what is not. And I think that there are all kinds of ways in which you can see the habits and practices and legal theories designed for the war on terror that do kind of trickle down into ordinary law and ordinary life. Let me turn now to the impact on the behavior of other states towards their own populations, and I think I'll just mention it briefly because I know it's already been a topic of a lot of discussion. But obviously, when the United States, what proudly proclaims itself the world's oldest democracy and the world's sole remaining superpower, does things that so greatly destabilize the rule of law, other states follow suit. And other states that are far less scrupulous about human rights than the U.S. follow suit. And we've seen that in many, many settings in which U.S. arguments about detention, about surveillance, and indeed about targeted killings have been used by repressive regimes to justify what to us look much more like the straightforward repression of political opponents for ideological reasons. And I think that's likely to continue. And then third and finally, I would highlight the ways in which the U.S. actions in the post-9/11 world have begun to destabilize some of the international law rules on the use of force themselves. When the U.S., the world's sole superpower at this point, when its own legal theories, such as we can sort of construe them from leaked documents and so on, when we appear to be saying, we, the United States, have we think, the legal right to unilaterally decide when, where, and against whom we can use lethal force. And a state's sovereignty doesn't necessarily matter, because if we view that state as unwilling or unable to take what we view as appropriate action to address the threat, then we have the right to act anyway. And we get to decide who counts as a combatant, but we don't have to tell anyone the evidence. We don't even have to acknowledge when we use lethal force. We have a very fragile international architecture to constrain force that emerged out of the deaths of scores of millions of people, World War I and World War II. that is premised on this sort of very, very delicate balance between sovereignty and rights. And I think that balance, that those have always been in tension, but I think what we've seen in the last 15 years has been actions that are really putting more and more stress on that, and the tensions are getting at the point where they're beginning, I think, to really badly undermine the system itself. And I think we saw this in Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine. Actually, one of my favorite quotes from the always quotable Vladimir Putin on sovereignty a few years ago. I'll close with this. A few years ago, when Kosovo unilaterally declared its independence from Serbia, the Russians called on the United States and the European Union not to recognize Kosovar independence, and they said, you promised you wouldn't. Remember that whole business about swearing that you respected Serbian sovereignty and that Kosovo was part of Serbia and it might have autonomy and so on, but you weren't going to recognize any unilateral independence. And well, within a couple of days after Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence, both the US and the EU did exactly that and said, okay, Kosovo, you're a country, we recognize you. And Putin was furious, and he said something, and this is pretty much a direct quote, I may have one or two words wrong here, but he said something along the lines of, those of you who have recognized Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence, you do not understand what you are doing. You are undermining 150 years of international legal norms. And you have to understand that this is a two-sided stick, and the other side will come back and hit you in the face. And indeed, it has.
Hold on for one or two questions. Well, we've got to get Dean Brooks out of here, but we have time for two questions. I'm going to ask the first one, and that is, this morning, in both panels, we heard a lot about deterioration of the rule of law, and you've just described a lot more of it. So looking at the pendulum, can you see in your crystal ball, looking at history in retrospect, is the pendulum going to swing back, or are we going to be going through another decade or two of erosion of the rule of law under these circumstances?
I don't see anything good in my crystal ball in the next couple of decades. I think the pendulum will swing back eventually, but the last big pendulum swing on these issues consisted of World Wars I and II, which sucked, basically, right? I mean, there's a sort of happy international law story that we tell, which is that, there was chaos in Europe, there was the 30 Years' War, but then we had the Peace of Westphalia, and that was good, and that was an improvement, and then there was more chaos, and we got World War I, World War II, but then we got the UN Charter, and that was good, and we forget that, yeah, the pendulum does swing back, but it usually swings back only after global catastrophe.
What a positive response. So actually, Will is signaling me that Dean Brooks has to get out of here. On behalf of the Jackson Foundation, I want to thank Dean Brooks and all of our panelists this morning. It was just a very enlightening, sobering, and somewhat discouraging day. But the pendulum will swing back, hopefully in our lifetimes. So thanks very much.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I have to race off.
And I'd like Will Pomerantz, if he would, also to come on up for a sec.
So thank you so much, Professor Brooks, and thank you all for coming today. It was indeed a difficult discussion, I agree, but I think we've kind of at least put forward some very important issues as we go forward and as we try to contemplate what the future actually looks in terms of rule of law and the question of how one actually approaches the difficult issue of the age of terrorism, which in many ways defines the early part of the 21st century. So thank you so much to John. Oh, I'm being, yes.
And, we have this history of having two-part series. I don't think we have a Jackson Foundation Canon Institute second part to this, but let's think about maybe how on the second part we can come up with some positive future projections. Okay, thanks, Will.
Yeah. We're all for positive. I do study a part of the region that hasn't been overly positive for the last 4 or 5 years. But again, thanks so much to the Jackson Foundation, to John, to Laura, to Craig. Thanks to all our speakers, and thank you for coming today.